one of those questions that I'm sure any engineer could talk about for days. And this is one of those I think I've got 50 or so I could probably give, but this is three that came to mind, and I'll talk through these to get started. So the first one is, don't just learn to learn. This is huge, and it may sound kind of somewhat counterintuitive because, yeah, well, you're trying to learn something new. Yeah, go. Why wouldn't you just learn to learn? But having structure provides a significant and unfair advantage if you're trying to learn a new skill. So, for example, if you're just trying to learn a language, like you're trying to learn Mandarin or Spanish, having that little bit of extra structure goes a long way. And structure could mean like something formal, like formal class, but to me, it really means like having a goal in mind that provides a really clear set of steps that would get you there. So if you're learning how to write code, just saying, hey, I want to learn a language is great, but how do you get there? What steps do you take to get there? It can be really kind of overwhelming, and it's easy to spend a lot of time and wasted learning things that aren't really a part of that journey. So for me, when I first got started, I remember a family member said, hey, if you want to learn to write code, really you should learn some HTML, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start learning tonight. And I didn't really remember exactly what he said, so I just started searching jQuery. That was the one thing I remembered. And I think I spelled it like J-A-Y query. But I eventually found it and started learning it. Now, if you're familiar with jQuery, you know that you can't just, it's not really the best way to learn just starting with jQuery. You really want to know HTML, then CSS, then probably some JavaScript, and then some jQuery, not just jump into jQuery. But that's kind of proves the point, though, is without a really clear goal, like I want to build a website, or a really clear goal of the structure of a class or something to kind of walk me through those steps, it can be really easy to get off to the wrong start. And I learned jQuery, but I didn't really know what these IDs were and classes were and all this stuff that you really need to make it work. So those are some time, something I wish I could have avoided. The second one is Googling is a feature, not a bug. So anyone who's been in software for a while knows this to be just the absolute truth, which is you got to spend probably more time than you care to admit looking things up on the internet every single day just to get through the day. And that's actually just a part of the job. And this isn't a mistake. You shouldn't be embarrassed. This isn't something you should look like, what am I doing wrong? Instead, you should be really get really good at it and find ways of mastering what words equal what results, and find ways of being able to articulate your questions so that way you get good answers, not just from the internet, but also from peers, and being able to actually explain what your problem is. So I remember in my first programming job, I was so embarrassed. Like I didn't know a lot of things, and I knew very little, and so I had to look up a lot, and I felt really embarrassed every time I had to switch over to Google and search for something like, what are these basic concepts? But I remember I had a senior engineer there, and his name was Justin, and I remember he came over to me. He's like, man, I don't know why you're so embarrassed. Like, this is like part of the job. Being able to find answers is actually really a part of your job description. So don't be embarrassed. Like, he had a big pile of books by his desk, and he always had a window open for Googling things. And that is so true. I think now I appreciate it more than ever. Even if you're really, really familiar with something, it's just impractical to have everything memorized. Instead, focus on being aware of something, but not necessarily spending the time to memorize the details. For example, you may not necessarily know exactly what like a programming method does, but you know that it exists. And that gives you all that you need to search for it, or ask somebody, hey, what's the specific, like syntax for this, versus being completely ignorant. So you want to have certain things memorized and have the tree of knowledge, but not necessarily have to have all the leaves. And that kind of is probably a realistic balance there. So the last tip, know why you're learning. Oh, this is a huge one. So a lot of people just say, hey, I want to learn to write code, but it's like, but why? Because if you don't really know the why behind it, it can be really you have a very confused path to actually getting there. So for example, if your goal is to get a job, okay, that's a very specific journey, and there's a very clear set of steps to get there. But if you just want to become a craftsperson, become a real master of it, then that's a different journey and a different mindset. Like when you have a very clear goal of getting hired as a software engineer, well, then it's pretty easy to look at a job description and get a sense of the kind of skills that you would need to get that job. But if you're really trying to become a craftsperson of, the art of software, then really the domain of knowledge that you're trying to obtain is a little wider. And if you're a front-end person, you don't look at some back-end language or back-end principle and say that, hey, that's not a part of what I'm trying to learn. Instead, you say, hey, I want to learn it all. I want to be a craftsperson and understand the entire spectrum of information related to this topic. And I will say, they're not necessarily one or the other. I mean, it kind of depends on where you are in your career and where you are, in your learning journey. For me, when I wanted to get that first programming job, obviously it didn't make sense for me to learn everything. It made sense for me to learn just what I needed to get that job and really focus on information adjacent to the job description. Versus once I did have the job, having an open mind and be interested in learning everything and not say, hey, that's not my job, or not to say, hey, that's not really part of what I want to learn. Because the more you learn about topics that aren't necessarily part of what you do in your day job, makes you that much more useful and helps you enjoy, I think, the experience of writing code that much more. Because even if JavaScript, knowing Java, I think provides just a wider scope of understanding and appreciation, and also context for the origins of JavaScript and why it's called JavaScript. Like knowing how maybe types in Java work may give you context for why TypeScript is the way it is. And there's a lot of context and enjoyment you can get by having a wider scope of understanding. And it doesn't hurt your prospects in an interview when you can explain that context and explain your knowledge of not just that one domain, but the wider domain of software. So those are just 3 tips that came to mind. I've got a lot more that I'm going to be talking about in future videos, but I hope that was useful and interesting to you. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.